Lavrov gave an interview to TV BRICS and openly accused the United States of not being ready to stand by its own proposals on Ukraine after the Anchorage meeting. He sounded unusually irritated. He said Trump's team speaks against Bidenism, but in reality acts even tougher toward Russia through sanctions, energy pressure, and limits on oil revenues. At the same time, several Western analysts say the oil and energy pressure on Russia is now entering a critical phase. So I'd like to walk through this step by step with Dr. Thomas O'Donnell, an American energy and geopolitics strategist based in Berlin. Dr. O'Donnell, it's my pleasure to have you here again.
It's my pleasure to be here with you, Natalie.
So Lavrov sounded not just tough, but clearly irritated. And I think that's a nice thing to begin with. So he says Trump is against Bidenism, but is doing even worse to Russia in practice. So are current U.S. measures against Russian oil and energy actually tougher than before? And where exactly can we see that?
Well, yes, they are much tougher than before. It's clear that the old strategy of an oil price cap is dead. It's been abandoned. And there's a new strategy. I wrote a paper, which I think I sent to you, that was published last week called Liquidating the Russian Petrostate. And in there, I trace how since April, well, essentially what happened in roughly April, in the United States. As we all know, Trump had this idea of offering enticements to Putin, big economic deals and so forth. Come on, you can be a modern country. We can welcome you back into the West with your oil and gas, but also develop your country and forget this trying to grab the Donbass and so forth, okay? And to Trump's thinking, hey, this sounds logical. Why not? But Putin, to Trump's surprise, apparently, had no interest in this. He wants to pursue the war. So Trump's cabinet, they had already had discussions since January. What would we do if this doesn't work? But as I trace in my paper, in April and May, they started discussing, okay, we have to inflict pain. And Trump famously said, okay, pain, I can do pain. And I think there's two aspects to this. One is to help Ukraine militarily in new ways with weapons and so forth. Yes, paid for by the Europeans, but that's a bit of a distraction. I mean, that's a good thing they're paying. But the fact is actually help militarily in various ways. And number two, which is what I've focused on, is that the oil price cap wasn't working. It wasn't designed to work. It was thought by the previous administration and also by some of Trump's people, Republicans too, that you can't take Russian oil offline. This is an old Cold War idea. Russia is one of the three biggest producers in the world. If we take them offline, oil prices everywhere will go up and there'll be catastrophe for the West. And Russia has used this in the past as a lever against the West. So it wasn't crazy. But the oil market had changed. There's so much surplus oil in the market right now, we could talk about that you can take Russian barrels offline without causing a disaster. And there are so many barrels waiting to be brought back online, for example, Venezuela, but other places, that you could permanently remove Russia. And so I believe they started a program step by step in coordination with Ukraine to actually start to squeeze the Russian petrostate and have Putin and Lavrov realize that they are able, the West is able, the United States and Ukraine primarily, to actually ruin their oil fields in the long run. I could go through the details of what they've done, but it's it's showing to be quite an effective policy. And I think this is what Lavrov is crying about. If you look in that interview, I mean, I can go through what they're doing in this oil campaign. I've done that before with you, and it's gotten much more intense lately with seizure of ships and so forth, of these shadow fleet ships. But what Lavrov was crying about, this is the first time that really the three sides have sat together since the beginning of the war. They've sat together, and the Russians haven't just made some declaration like he did in Anchorage, Putin did, where he lectured Trump about his vision of Russian history and what Russia deserves, and sort of ruined the whole meeting. This time they've sat there and they start to have, according to the Americans and to the Ukrainians, they have more substantive discussions about, okay, what kind of a deal would we make? What would happen to the front line and so forth? This is new. And I think this shows that Russia realizes they're not making advances on the battlefield. They've been checked. It's very difficult for them. And number two, as time goes on, if they don't talk seriously, the United States and Ukraine can actually crush their oil system.
Yes, Dr. O'Donnell. But I just want to clarify about the tankers and oil transferred, because one of my experts pointed out that while we're so focused on transporting oil, and all these restrictions to Russia, there are also, through sea and water, there are also another routes. So the sea is not the only route for us. And do you think that Russia could actually use another way to deliver an oil?
Not for most of its oil, no.
Okay.
The only significant land routes it has is the old Druzhba pipeline that takes basically all the oil produced in the whole Siberian region, especially West Siberia. That's the really important fields for Russia, old fields.
What about railway stations?
Well, you want to send a train from that region to India. Okay, I guess you could do that. You have some nice mountains. No, this is the same thing. And the other way, so there's that, and that's all cut off. That system is only used to supply the big ports. And that's what I'm talking about they're going after, okay? The west-facing Russian ports, Ust-Luga, Primorsk, and Novorossiya. However, there is a big pipeline that collects oil across eastern Siberia, a separate system, goes to a port near Japan, basically, and from there, China can get 1 million, 1.5 million barrels. It's a little complicated, some by sea, some by a spur pipeline. Now, that pipeline's hard to cut off, but it's full. There's nowhere else. In fact, the Druzhba pipelines are full. Now, a little story, if you remember, years ago, Putin had a disagreement with a Russian dissident, and the disagreement was this guy wanted to sell oil to China, and he said, I'm going to build a pipeline. Putin says, no, the state decides who builds a pipeline. He said, okay, I'll send it by rail. Anyway, that was Hodorkovsky. He put him in jail. So it's very difficult to get things by rail to China. They really have a problem in their commerce. It's a separate issue. The infrastructure is not very good. There's lots of mountains and huge distances. So this is not viable as a substitute for cutting off the seaboard oil. I don't believe it.
Mm-hmm. Dr. O'Donnell, but if the war negotiations fail, let's imagine, how realistic is it that the United States will sharply increase energy and oil pressure on Russia, more than even now? If you have heard, the European Union want to unite their efforts regarding seizing Russian oil tankers and etc. Together in the 20th package of sanctions. So could you please elaborate on that one?
This is quite interesting. I went to a number of security conferences in Europe where serious people who really don't like Russia, from NATO, from the Baltic countries especially, and from Germany around the Baltic Sea, really talking about, together with colleagues from Kiev who worked in think tanks, economists from Kiev, how can we stop these shadow ships in the Baltic on what excuse? And the Europeans always said, look, it's just we don't have the legal right. We stop them, and later on they'll take it to court, and it'll be embarrassing. Now, the Americans have gotten around this by saying, these aren't legal ships. They're changing their flag. That means it's not clear who they belong to. If there's a ship that doesn't have clear ownership, under the UN conventions, you can seize that ship, okay? And that's what the Americans are doing. They've done it with ships that were headed for Venezuela. But clearly they were willing to confront Russia. One of these ships thought by quickly changing its flag and heading to the North Atlantic and saying, we're Russian, and Putin warning to leave it alone and sending a Russian submarine to escort it. That didn't stop the Americans. They sent sub-hunting planes to shadow the whole thing and then landed and put troops on and took the ship, special forces. So this opened the door I think, opened the eyes of the Europeans for another way to do these things. And the French have started by seizing one or two ships. And so this is a new tool. But I want to emphasize it's only one tool in a whole game plan that started last April. And I'll just list quickly for you, if you don't mind. That game plan included basically forgetting the oil price cap, aiming to take Russian barrels offline. So first, it was the American CIA and American logistics military people in the New York Times. This was all developed together to the current campaign against Russian refineries and ports. And so that's been done with American assistance. Now, that's quite interesting. The prior Biden administration and early Trump administration said, please don't hit the ports, please don't hit refineries, because we got to keep Russian oil online. This marked the change I'm talking about. Number two, the Americans started putting real tariffs and real sanctions on the exports of oil. Here in Europe, everybody, basically in the think tanks, and many lower officials told me, no way will Trump, no way can the United States ever stop India from taking Russian oil. He's too close to Modi. Modi is too close to Putin and to Xi Jinping. Well, they did it. And the agreement was actually, as I show in my paper, the agreement was actually reached in October. And Trump said it's going to take Modi a little while, but Modi agrees. Okay, and the other aspect, as soon as he got off the phone, and this is according to the Secretary of the Interior, Doug Burgum, who was sitting there at the time when he got done talking to Modi in October, he said, get me MBS on the phone. That is to say, get me Mohammed bin Salman, the leader of Saudi Arabia. And what Doug Burgum says, he said to him is, hey, Modi's agreed to stop taking Russian oil. It's going to take him a little while, but we got a market for you. This is your market you can take back. Okay, and so the American administration has been working together with the Saudis, the UAE, and so forth, together with the Indians now and others to actually take the oil offline. And you look at it, Russian oil right now is getting to a point where it has nowhere to go. The Druzhba is at about 100%. They're pumping from those fields. The Ukrainians hit the refineries and they can't refine all the oil, so they put it in the pipeline to export. Now, Rosneft is sanctioned, Lukoil is sanctioned, India is not taking oil step by step. They don't have no place to put it. Many of the ships they're putting the oil on have no destination. And the amount of oil floating on the water, Russian oil floating on the water, is up by about 50% since a few months ago. And they're trying to store some oil in Indonesia. The point is they're at the breaking point. It's like a balloon that's going to pop. And if there's not another outlet, if other outlets are cut off, it can pop. And then in the wintertime, they're going to have to shut off fields, old fields in West Siberia, and they will be ruined. Okay. And that's what's really, I think, on the energy front, that's what Lavrov feels. If they don't make nice in these negotiations, do something reasonable, and they fail, either Trump will approve the Senate bill, Lindsey Graham and the Republican, and Mr. Blumenthal, the Democrat, have 93 senators, they say, who will vote 500% tariffs, give Trump permission, 500% tariffs in any country that's buying Russian oil. It's incredible. Or Secretary of the Interior has briefed the Europeans well over a month ago that they have a whole set of new sanctions that would do something similar. So look at it as Russia is pumping this oil. It can't get it out. There's nowhere to go. And they can't really shut off these fields. They're not like ordinary fields. They're in the tundra. They're in Siberia. They're very old. If you shut them off fast, they'll be ruined long term. And this will undermine the petrostate. And that's the American aim, actually, longer term. Whether Trump will pull the trigger on that, of course, we wait and see. But he's set everything up for that situation.
Dr. O'Donnell, but what is, since you touched India, when I look at India, it seems like I don't really understand what their line is about. I feel like India is quite pro-Russian, let's be honest. I don't want to be delusional. But it seems like they are saying to Washington, yes, okay, we will not buy Russian oil. They're saying, yes to Russia, we're going to buy your cheap oil. So what is their main strategy and line here today?
Well, in the most general terms, I think one has to understand India is primarily pro-India.
Oh, okay.
And in a certain sense, the elites in I'm not. In a certain sense, the elites in India, they don't care if there's a fight between Russia and the United States. How can we take advantage and get cheap oil? Okay, so everybody said it was going to be impossible. I talked to diplomats who had been there for years when they came back, and they said, "There's no way I can see the Indians doing this." So, okay, when Trump said, "Okay, 85% of the oil Russia was exporting was going to India and China. A certain amount was going to Turkey. But 85% to those two countries is clear. You got to cut first one off, then the other." So the Americans went after the lower hanging fruit. They went after India. And India had a lot of vulnerabilities. It does a lot of trade with the United States. Now, it's not huge volumes of trade as far as percentage wise, but it's high tech stuff. And they actually have their people go to the United States and work in their high tech sector, services and so forth. This is really important for India's future. So Trump said, hey, you either stop buying Russian oil or 25% extra tariffs. You already have 25%. There were all sorts of Indian companies that had to find someplace else to work. I mean, they had a real problem. So I think Trump understood that Modi at home, he could not act like, okay, Mr. Trump, he can't kowtow to Trump. He's got to act the big man. So he went right away and met Xi Jinping and Putin and talked the big man. We do all these things together with you guys. And he came back and Trump called him twice. And it's interesting. The first time he called him, he said he had a deal, basically a deal with Modi. And immediately this is in early October, immediately the Indian Foreign Office said, there is no phone call. We never even talked to him. Who's he? Okay, that's how sensitive it was. But here's what happened. After Modi went around with Xi Jinping and Putin and made this show, we're going to do more with you. When Putin visited, by the way, he actually didn't give him much of any contracts. Trump called him again, and Trump saw he had to give him a way out. Trump had already in his pocket the sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil, but they hadn't been announced. So I'm quite sure what he said on the phone call is, look, I know you can't say I'm going to obey Trump and not take sanctions. That looks bad for you at home. You'll never get elected again. But I'm going to put sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil. That's most of where it comes from. So you can turn around and say, it's not me. They sanctioned these things. If we take it, our banks are going to be in big trouble. It's not me. Trump got me here. Okay. And that's the way it happened. And as soon as he got off the phone from that call, Trump, what I explained earlier is what happened. Burgum said he called up MBS, he called up the Saudis and say, okay, we're ready. You start thinking about taking the Indian market. And actually Saudi Arabia and UAE started giving discounts on oil to India and China. They do want to take that market back. This has been a source of tension with the Russians dumping cheap oil there for a long time. So Trump saw what was going on. In the end, Modi doesn't look so bad. It's not like he gave in, but effectively he can't take the oil. So he finessed it. And in actuality, the flow to India is going way down. And the Chinese, of course, are now telling the Russians, well, you want us to still take it, you're going to have to give another discount. And the Russian oil is getting really discounted. So less of a market, much more discounted, nowhere to put a lot of it. They got to keep pumping it. They can't turn off the fields. They're putting it on ships, storing it in Indonesia. Another hit's going to be bad for them, I think.
Dr. Donald, many analysts and media now say the Russian economy is sliding towards crisis, but is it typical for the Russian system to allow truly negative economic signals to become public, since even before the Soviet Union has collapsed? Our Western and especially US media may be, celebrating too early the collapse of a Russian economy?
Well, you're right. They try to prettify a lot of things, the Chinese maybe even more. But on the other hand, if you want to do business with anybody, you can't completely lie or you get in trouble. And the number of countries they can do business with is being restricted. They're trying to make this Eurasian zone. Actually, that same interview yesterday with Lavrov, he made a big deal about a new Eurasian zone. And I don't think that Eurasian zone is going so well with Kazakhstan, with Azerbaijan, with China. In fact, the whole story is that these countries are coming closer to the United States and the European Union. So, yes, they cook the data, but if you consider that they cook the data, if they're actually giving out negative data, it must be pretty bad, okay? And we know overwhelmingly their income is from oil, overwhelmingly. And also they do trade in agriculture that has trouble. And that's in big trouble right now. And a very high percentage of their national budget is going to weapons and to the war. And so this is going to put a constraint. And, you know, it's true the Russian people don't have much say in what happens to them. And they're willing to be squeezed. They're filled with propaganda from the state and so forth. But there's a limit to how much they can be squeezed before you get protests. Even people who might be pro-war are still going to protest about the way they eat, that the problems with eating, problems with social services. So I think this is a significant problem for Russia in the short term, that they could get this money cut off. And what I'm talking about, the looming threat, is if Trump and the Ukrainians go to the next stage, they put these U.S. Senate sanctions or these other sanctions that the Interior Department has prepared, another hard hit, it could actually ruin the Russian oil sector. And that's not just about Ukraine. You listen to what these senators are saying, not only Republicans, Democrats are saying, Russia has caused problems because they say it's a gas station masquerading as a state. If we undermine this cheap money, they make money so easily from their petrostate. If we undermine that, it won't only be Ukraine. Well, they won't be able to cause trouble in Africa, in the Middle East, in Kazakhstan, in Latin America, and so forth. And so there's this appetite in the U.S. to undermine Russia long term. Now, whether it'll go that far, Trump has to get a deal, so he might stop short of that. But I'm just saying there's an appetite for that. And some of the reason there's the support for doing what Trump did in Venezuela is to get all that oil online as a substitute longer term for if they do that to Russia.
And finally, I would also like to touch the U.S.-Russian nuclear arms limits and warhead gaps. Well, the agreement has already expired, and it was already weak. I mean, right. Russia was not listening. So how dangerous is this moment for strategic stability? And I cannot understand China's position here.
Yes. Well, this is a great game. But, okay. So first, I just want to say, everybody who's on TV or YouTube lately wants to be the expert in everything. This is not my expertise. I'm a nuclear physicist, but I have followed this nuclear issue as it intersected with many other things over the years, issues in the Middle East with Iran and so forth. So I'll give you my view of what the overview of what's long-term, what's going on here. So for the United States during when George Bush was president, 2008, 2009, Russia was already developing a medium-range missile, nuclear capable, but medium-range missile with a range longer than is allowed by the INF treaty. Okay, and then they first started, that was 2008, 2009, they started testing it. So George Bush put missiles, he announced he would put missiles in Poland and Romania, and he said those were to counter Iranian missiles that might someday come up over the North Pole and hit the United States. And though that system he was putting in, if I remember, a GNS system, I think it was bigger interceptors, okay? But people said that's not going to affect, it's not going to get the Iranian missiles. Even if they did that, this is a threat to Russia. And so I think what was going on here, this is at the end of the Bush administration. People asked me, I said, I think one president leaves a chip on the table for the next president to use, okay? And what happened is Obama then needed sanctions on Iran. He wanted to completely cut off Iran's oil exports and so forth. And the bargain he made with Putin was, oh, you don't like these, the missile system we're starting to install because you see that they could intercept your big missiles. And Putin said, yes, so we made a deal. If you support the sanctions on Iran, I'll turn that into not a strategic system, but what we'll call a tactical system. And that's what's being installed now. So the Russians agreed to this, and he supported the sanctions. He flipped on the Iranians at the time. Now, of course, Russia continued on complaining as though this is a very life-threatening missile system, this Aegis system that's being installed in these countries. Now, my understanding is if they use the system the way they say they're using the system, it's slower and shorter range and doesn't violate the treaty. It's true if they came and put Tomahawks in there, that would be very difficult for Russia. But Russia already developed this missile starting in the early 2000s and had it operational in the 2010s. That violates the treaty. So I think it was Bush, Obama, and then when Trump came, Biden, and then when Trump came, they all agreed that the Russians have been violating the spirit and actually violating these treaties, and they weren't going to sign the treaties unless the Russians, did what they're supposed to do. Now, the problem here is the Americans, if they observe the treaty, they're locked into this and they can't develop these capabilities. But China has about 600, we think, nuclear warhead, nuclear missile sites that they want to triple or so. And they refuse to discuss. So the Americans have said, sure, let's get Russia to obey these, to really respect these treaties, but let's bring China in. Otherwise, we're playing this game here, restricting ourselves, and China's going to develop very fast. Got to bring China in. And China says they won't even discuss anything until they have parity, until they have as many missiles as the US and Russia. So it's a little bit complicated, but generally speaking, I think Russia first took the steps to violate the spirit of this treaty and actually violate the treaty. The Americans responded in various ways, used it as leverage at different times. And now they're really worried about the Chinese, and they're not going to play this game with the Russians anymore. We need to deal with the Chinese and the Russians.
Dr. O'Donnell,
but all the presidents agreed. All the presidents basically didn't say anything different.
Yeah. Russia is always violating any deals first.
Yeah.
So they're doing
well,
that.
Sometimes if we can cut a corner somewhere and get them, maybe two, but yes.
Well,
but yes, yes, I agree with you. They did. They started this whole thing with developing that missile in the Bush administration. Yes.
Correct. 100%. Dr. O'Donnell, thank you so much again for being on War and Politics at Channel 24, and I'm waiting for you again in our studio. Thank you.
Very much. I enjoy it. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.